Hello, today we're going to be talking about biogeochemical cycles. Bio means life, geo means earth, chem means chemical, and cycle is to move in a ring or a circle. So if we put all these together, we have chemicals moving in a circle between life and earth. There were 6 main elements we discussed that are used in life forms. We had a made-up word CHNOPS to help us remember those 6 elements. They were carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Today we're going to look at how 4 of these elements move between the biotic and abiotic factors in ecosystems, and those 4 elements are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. Biogeochemical cycles are the patterns or processes that an element or molecule uses to move between the biotic factors or living things in the environment and the abiotic factors or the non-living things in the environment. Matter tends to become more disorganized if energy is not put into the system to maintain it. An example of this would be your bedroom. If you're not constantly putting energy into cleaning and maintaining the cleanliness of your bedroom, you're going to wind up with a swirling vortex of chaos and everything's just going to be everywhere. It's the same thing with life forms. We put a lot of energy into maintaining the structure of our bodies, making sure that atoms and molecules are where they need to be. But when an organism dies, it's no longer putting energy toward maintaining the structure of that body, and so those elements and molecules tend to disintegrate, and those are recycled back into the environment. The 3 cycles that we are going to look at today are the carbon-oxygen cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the water cycle, which is not pictured here. Water uses the chemical formula H2O. So when we look at the water cycle, we're going to be talking about how hydrogen and oxygen move through ecosystems. There are other cycles as well, but these are the 3 we're going to focus on for the scope of this course. We'll start with the carbon-oxygen cycle, and we'll focus first on how the biotic factors, the living things, interact with this cycle. Carbon and oxygen exist in all organisms. In fact, most of a living thing is made of oxygen bound to a variety of molecules to make them solids. But it is not the most important element for the structure of a life form. That element would be carbon. Due to its chemical structure and its 4 valence electrons, carbon can bond with other elements and molecules in any direction, which gives it a lot of opportunity to make different shapes in these molecules used for life, like carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Carbon and oxygen also exist in the environment, mostly as carbon dioxide and oxygen. Now, they exist in other forms as well, but these are the 2 that we're going to focus on. Living things use 2 processes to move carbon and oxygen around in ecosystems, and those 2 processes are photosynthesis and respiration. Plants and algae can take atmospheric carbon dioxide, combine it with water, and use energy from the sun to make carbohydrates like glucose. Remember, carbohydrates are sugars. This is the only way that carbon dioxide can be removed from the atmosphere. You see by this diagram, there's lots of ways to put it back, but photosynthesis is the only way to take carbon out. Now, once plants have made these carbohydrates with their carbon dioxide and water, they're going to release oxygen as a byproduct. Our animals can then take in that oxygen and break down the carbohydrates that they get from eating plants during the process of respiration. As animals break down that glucose in the presence of oxygen, they're going to release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Keep in mind that plants do not just make this glucose for animals to eat. They actually make the glucose for themselves. So plants do respiration too. They break down that glucose and release carbon dioxide as a waste product. However, plants tend to take in more carbon dioxide during photosynthesis than they release during respiration. But either way, with photosynthesis and respiration, we get this nice little circle of how carbon dioxide and oxygen move through the environment. Now, when an animal or a plant dies or emits waste, that waste can be broken down by bacterial decomposers, and that's going to return some of these elements back to the soil, and it's going to release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere again through respiration. Now, there are other processes here that we looked at that can release carbon dioxide, but these are abiotic processes. The abiotic factors in the environment are the non-living things in the environment, and they can release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as well. When fossil fuels are burned, like in factories or in cars, you can see all of this smoke in the atmosphere, and this smoke has carbon dioxide and other pollutants in it. Now, this smoke tends not to stay right on top of the factory. It's going to be blown away by weather, and so you end up with pollution far away from these factories. We also have volcanic eruptions. You can see the smoke leaving from this volcano as chemicals are released from the earth. And anytime you burn something organic, like a fossil fuel or wood, for example, then you're going to get carbon dioxide released in the smoke as that organic thing is burning. So whether a forest fire is human or naturally caused, carbon dioxide is going to be released by that fire into the atmosphere. I mentioned that factories and cars burn fossil fuels and they release this smoke containing carbon dioxide and other pollutants, but usually this smoke is going to blow far away from the area. However, in 1952, there was a unique event called the Great Smog of London. It lasted for 4 days from December 5th to December 9th. And what happened was there was a temperature inversion which trapped all of this smog and wouldn't let it go anywhere. It couldn't blow away. There was no wind to blow it. So it ended up just sitting over the town of London, and the cars and the smokestacks kept burning, so the smoke kept getting thicker and thicker. And after 4 days, you really couldn't drive a car because you couldn't see where you were going. Now, this smoke got into people's respiratory systems and caused some serious illnesses in about 100,000 people and killed about 4,000 people in those 4 days. You could read about that if you want. It's called the Great Smog of London. So what is a fossil fuel? Well, fossil fuels are basically condensed carbon, and carbon exists in the bodies of all living things. And once these living things die, then they're going to start to be buried under layers and layers and layers of sediment. And over time, that sediment is going to put a significant amount of pressure and a significant amount of heat on those decaying organisms, and all of that carbon is going to be pushed together into your fossil fuels, your coal, your oil, and your natural gases. Now, this process can take millions of years to occur and is the longest part of the carbon cycle. Anytime we burn an organic thing or you have a combustion reaction, you're going to release two products, carbon dioxide and water. Now, when you burn an organic thing, oxygen is going to need to be used as a reactant. So notice the similarity between cellular respiration, which uses organic glucose, and oxygen to create energy while making carbon dioxide and water. So cellular respiration is a combustion reaction. And combustion reactions can occur also when we burn fossil fuels or we burn wood for fuel or during forest fires. No doubt you have heard of the greenhouse effect, and the greenhouse effect is caused by things known as greenhouse gases. Now, greenhouse gases act like a blanket for our planet. And what happens when you put on a thicker blanket at night? Well, you get warmer. And what happens if you use a thinner blanket? Well, you get colder. So greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, these act like insulation for the planet. So we can't go completely without these greenhouse gases. Otherwise, our planet would become a cold little ball that would be inhospitable to life. You couldn't live here. But we don't need too many, or the planet can become too hot and life forms cannot survive. Now, humans add these different greenhouse gases to the environment by burning fossil fuels and other organic materials. Volcanic eruptions can add these greenhouse gases. And fun fact for you, sulfur dioxide is actually a greenhouse gas that reflects heat back out into space. So it can actually make the planet cooler, and you can have what is called a volcanic winter. Now, carbon dioxide, we talked about how that comes from respiration. So does water vapor. Methane is actually a chemical with 23 times the global warming power of carbon dioxide. So why don't we focus on methane? Well, carbon dioxide is kind of unavoidable. We're going to breathe it out. We're going to have to use fossil fuels for now, at least, in order to get by. But methane is produced much less often. This is made in landfills. It's also caused by cow flatulence, which is another reason that cattle farming on a large scale is kind of frowned upon. And we look at more sustainable ways to grow cattle and provide beef. Let's move on to the nitrogen cycle, and we'll see how nitrogen moves between the biotic factors, the organisms in an ecosystem, and the abiotic factors, the non-living things like water, rocks, minerals, and the atmosphere in an ecosystem. Well, why is nitrogen important? It makes up so many molecules in our body, we have to have it, especially nucleic acids like DNA. You see all these little purple dots are nitrogen atoms. So there's a lot of nitrogen in a DNA molecule. We also use it to make amino acids and proteins. Remember, this amino group here has nitrogen in it, and we find that in all amino acids. And we have the amino group joining to the carboxyl group through dehydration synthesis, pulling out this water molecule, and that's going to give us a peptide bond between this carbon and nitrogen. So you absolutely have to have nitrogen to make proteins. And we also see nitrogen present in our ATP molecule, adenosine triphosphate, and this is your body's currency of energy. This is how your body is going to spend its energy. The atmosphere is mostly nitrogen. It's about 78% nitrogen, so it's a large pool, but most organisms can't use this. I think of it as being broken when it's in the atmosphere, and if you want to use something that's broken, you have to fix it. So we have little bacteria in the soil mostly that are going to take this nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it so that it can be used. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to turn it into nitrites and then nitrates that plants can then take in as fertilizer and use. Now there are some plants, legumes like peas and beans and peanuts, that have little nodules on their roots where these nitrogen fixing bacteria live, and they can take in this nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and fix it so that these plants can use it. When plants use nitrogen, we say that it has been assimilated. It's been taken into the plant and turned into part of its body. So plants are going to take in nitrates, which again were fixed by these nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil or the roots of certain plants. And this nitrogen, once it's incorporated into a plant, is then going to be able to be used by other organisms in the food chain through consumption. So our herbivores, our primary consumers, are able to eat a plant and get nitrogen from it for their ATP, amino acids, and DNA. Once nitrogen has been incorporated or assimilated into a plant and passed on up the food chain into an animal, it's going to come out as a waste product, or these plants and animals are going to die. And that nitrogen stored in the bodies and in the waste products of these plants and animals is going to have to be returned to the atmosphere. And we have a different set of bacteria that are going to do that. So we call these denitrifying bacteria, and they participate in denitrification. They're going to take this nitrogen out of the bodies of these plants, out of these nitrates, and they're going to convert it back into atmospheric nitrogen. So we have this nice little circle going through the nitrogen cycle. And this typically is going to happen in the soil and in marine environments or in watery environments. The nitrogen cycles had a huge impact on climate. In the early 1900s, there simply weren't enough nitrates available in the soil to grow crops needed to feed a growing population. So two German scientists created a process called the Haber-Bosch process, where they could take atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into fertilizers that could be spread on fields and greatly increase the productivity. However, these fertilizers are being overused, and when fertilizers are overused, they wash away into water bodies. So we see this a lot in the middle of America, where a lot of our corn is grown. So all of these fertilizers washing down the Mississippi River eventually find their way into the Gulf of Mexico. And this inspires lots of algae to grow. And this algae has a very short lifespan. So when these algae die, they sink. And when they sink, they're decomposed. Now remember, decomposers breathe just like you and I do. So they're sucking oxygen out of the water while breaking down the carbohydrates in this algae. And this is going to lower the oxygen content of the water, creating something called a hypoxic or a dead zone. Now these are areas where fish tend to die or move away from because there's not enough oxygen in the water to support their existence. So these hypoxic zones have ruined commercial fishing here in the Gulf of Mexico. You can see how big this hypoxic zone is. And again, this is caused by excess nitrogen in fertilizers washing down into waterways and causing these big algal blooms. And this happens to be a red tide, which in addition to causing these hypoxic zones also releases neurotoxic compounds that can be very dangerous to swim in and can cause respiratory issues. So if you see this in the water, you should not swim there. Another name for the water cycle is the hydrologic cycle, hydro meaning water. And like our carbon-oxygen cycle, this is going to be driven by energy from the sun. Now in the carbon-oxygen cycle, we had photosynthesis, which had to take in sunlight. And here we're going to use that sun to provide heat for evaporation when water turns from a liquid to a gas. So this is when you're looking outside at a puddle and it just kind of disappears throughout the day as the sun's energy heats it up. Once this water vapor gets high up in the atmosphere, it cools down and it can condense from a gas to a liquid and make clouds. You also see this when you have a cold glass of water or lemonade, tea, whatever you like, sitting out on your counter, and water is going to condense from the atmosphere onto that glass and you get your little droplets of water. Once in the atmosphere and you get enough of these clouds that come together, gravity is going to pull this water back down to Earth through precipitation. A couple of processes we don't think about as often but are still part of the hydrologic cycle are respiration and transpiration. Keep in mind during respiration we break down glucose in the presence of oxygen, and that's going to produce water vapor and carbon dioxide, both of which are greenhouse gases. But this water vapor is going to go up into the atmosphere, condense, and become part of these clouds, which can then fall back down as rain and runoff and all this good stuff. Transpiration is similar to evaporation, only we're not using heat energy from the sun, though this process is still driven by the sun because it's involved with photosynthesis. During transpiration, plants are going to take water in through their roots. It's going to travel up this tissue called xylem, which I think about like a straw, and the leftover waste water is going to move through the little holes in the leaves of the plants called stoma. So transpiration, water goes in through the roots, up through the xylem, and out through the stoma of the plant. And this is going to contribute water to the atmosphere, which can then condense and fall back down as precipitation. So if we cut down a lot of plants, we are going to reduce the amount of water entering the atmosphere by transpiration. Humans have greatly changed our climate and thus changed our water cycle. As our planet has heated up, more water can be held in the atmosphere, and this causes more frequent, larger, more violent storms like hurricanes. In fact, this year in 2020, we have made it all the way through the English alphabet and are now circling back through the Greek alphabet for named storms that have formed during our hurricane season. That hasn't happened since 2005. We also have events called rain bombs. And a few years ago, Hawaii received a rain bomb. It was actually the first time I'd heard of this term. They received 50 inches of rain in about 24 hours. And this was just prior to the volcanic eruption that took place in a different part of Hawaii than they're normally accustomed to. Water is also not distributed in the same way that it used to be. There are areas that do not get as much water as they used to, and other areas are getting way more water than they are used to. So this is causing some of the worst droughts in recorded history. India, for example, this was a lake in India in 2018. This was the same lake in 2019 because the monsoon season has become shorter and it's more delayed in the year. So this is causing India to run out of water. It's a very populated country, and 40% of the nation will have no access to drinking water in 2030. And there are 21 major Indian cities that were predicted to run out of groundwater this year alone. So our climate has changed, and these cycles have thus changed with it. And those are some important things to keep in mind when determining your role in the world. Here are the sources that I used, especially to get my images. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed.